On May the 6th, 2026, a single American fighter jet did something that no press release could soften and no diplomat could spin. It opened fire on a moving oil tanker in international waters, and it did so without sinking it, without killing a single sailor aboard, and without triggering the kind of headline-grabbing inferno that usually accompanies military strikes in the Gulf. Instead, it put 20mm cannon rounds directly into the rudder of an Iranian-flagged vessel called the F-18's, and in doing so, it introduced the world to a new kind of naval warfare, one built not around destruction, but around precision denial. This is the story of how that happened, why it happened, and what it means for a region that has spent decades treating the Strait of Hormuz as the most dangerous choke point on Earth. To understand why an F-18 Super Hornet was strafing an oil tanker's steering system with a Vulcan cannon, you have to go back to the last day of February, 2026, when war broke out between the United States and Iran. The details of how that war began are still debated in policy circles, but the consequences were immediate and unmistakable. Within weeks, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway through which roughly a fifth of the world's oil supply normally passes, became a battlefield in everything but name. Shipping insurers began pricing in war risk. Commercial captains started rerouting around the Arabian Peninsula. And in Washington, the conversation shifted from whether to respond to Iranian provocations to how aggressively the United States Navy should enforce control over one of the most economically vital pieces of ocean on the planet. By April the 1st, that question had an answer. The United States Central Command, known throughout the military as CENTCOM, confirmed that a full naval blockade against Iranian maritime traffic was now in effect. Any vessel attempting to enter or leave an Iranian port, and any ship suspected of carrying sanctioned Iranian oil exports, was now considered a target for interdiction. This was not a symbolic gesture. It was backed by carrier strike groups, destroyer squadrons, intelligence and reconnaissance aircraft, electronic warfare platforms, and marine boarding teams, all woven into what military planners would later describe as a layered blockade architecture. The goal was simple to state and extraordinarily difficult to execute: choke off Iran's oil revenue without triggering a wider war, and do it in one of the most heavily trafficked, mineable, and politically sensitive waterways in the world. Iran did not sit quietly while its economic lifeline was strangled. Intelligence assessments concluded that Iranian naval forces had begun deploying sea mines in and around the Strait, a tactic with a long and ugly history in this particular body of water. In response, on April the 11th, American naval forces began mine clearance operations, painstaking and dangerous work that rarely makes headlines, but is essential to keeping any blockade functional. The following day, April the 12th, the diplomatic track collapsed entirely. Vice President J.D. Vance confirmed that talks held in Islamabad had failed to produce any breakthrough, closing what was, by that point, the last functioning channel of negotiation between Washington and Tehran. With diplomacy exhausted and mines already in the water, President Donald Trump ordered the blockade into full effect, and the machinery of naval enforcement began grinding forward in earnest. What followed over the next several weeks was a slow-motion escalation that most of the world barely noticed, buried as it was beneath other headlines. Commercial vessels were stopped, boarded, warned, and in some cases turned away. The United Nations International Maritime Organization began tracking a rising tide of incidents. By the time the strikes on Iranian tankers made global news in May, the United Kingdom Maritime Trade Operations Organization, known as UKMTO, had already logged 46 separate reports of incidents affecting vessels in and around the Arabian Gulf, the Strait of Hormuz, and the Gulf of Oman since the war began. 26 of those were direct attacks on ships. 18 involved suspicious activity serious enough to warrant a report, and 2 vessels had already been hijacked outright. This was the environment into which the American Super Hornets flew when they finally opened fire. The first tanker in this story is the F-18's, an Iranian-flagged vessel that CENTCOM says was observed transiting international waters on a course toward an Iranian port in the Gulf of Oman. According to the American account, forces issued multiple warnings to the vessel, informing its crew in no uncertain terms that continuing on this course would violate the terms of the blockade. The Hasna, according to CENTCOM, ignored those warnings. What happened next was captured in official statements and later corroborated by defense journalists who specialize in naval aviation. A Super Hornet, flying off a carrier deck, closed on the tanker and opened fire, not with a missile, not with a guided bomb, but with its internal cannon, the M61A2 Vulcan, a rotary 6-barreled 20mm gun capable of spitting out thousands of rounds per minute. The pilot's target was not the hull, not the cargo tanks, not anywhere near the volatile crude oil the ship was likely carrying. The target was the rudder. This detail matters enormously, and it's worth sitting with for a moment, because it tells you almost everything about the doctrine the United States was applying in this operation. Striking a ship's rudder with cannon fire does not sink it. It does not set it ablaze. It does not kill the crew. What it does is destroy the vessel's ability to steer itself toward its destination. A tanker with a shredded rudder becomes, in naval terms, a mission kill, unable to complete its objective, but still afloat, still salvageable, still carrying its crew home alive. CENTCOM's own language afterward was almost clinical in its precision. After being fired upon, the command said, "The ship is no longer traveling to Iran, not destroyed, not sunk, simply and effectively stopped." The unit responsible for that strike carried a name with real history behind it. The aircraft belonged to Strike Fighter Squadron 14, nicknamed the Top Hatters, a Navy squadron whose lineage stretches back over a century, making it one of the oldest continuously commissioned squadrons in American naval aviation. Photographs released afterward showed sailors aboard the carrier removing the massive M61-82 Vulcan cannon from beneath the aircraft's nose for maintenance and inspection, a mundane bit of shipboard routine that, in this context, took on outsized significance. This was not an experimental weapon or an improvised tactic. It was a decades-old naval cannon, mounted on a modern strike fighter, being used in exactly the kind of surgical, non-lethal role that naval planners have quietly refined for years, but rarely had cause to demonstrate in front of the entire world. The timing of the Hormuz strike carried its own layer of tension. It came just hours after President Trump had paused a separate and much shorter-lived operation known as Project Freedom, an American mission designed to escort and protect commercial shipping attempting to flee the Persian Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth had described that mission as temporary from the outset, and indeed, it barely lasted a day before being suspended pending further negotiations with Iran. In a strange and telling coincidence, roughly 2 hours before Trump's decision to pause Project Freedom became public, a container vessel called the CMA-CGM San Antonio was attacked while transiting the region. 8 people aboard that ship were injured. A U.S. military official later said American forces were aware of reports about the attack, but had no further details on how exactly it happened, noting that the San Antonio's transit had not been coordinated through the American Protection Program, and that its crew had not sought U.S. assistance. It was a sobering reminder that even as the United States built out an increasingly sophisticated blockade and escort architecture, the waters of the Gulf remained lethal and unpredictable for anyone caught in the crossfire. 2 days after the Hosna was disabled, the operation escalated again, and this time it involved not one tanker, but 2. On May the 8th, CENTCOM announced that a Navy F-18's Super Hornet launched from the aircraft carrier USS George H. W. Bush had struck a pair of Iranian-flagged tankers identified as the MT Sea Star 3 and the MIT Sevda. This time, the weapon of choice was not the cannon, but precision-guided munitions, fired with pinpoint accuracy into the smokestacks of both vessels. Once again, the goal was not destruction, it was disablement. By striking the smokestack, a strike aircraft can knock out a ship's propulsion and exhaust systems, the mechanical heart that allows a massive tanker to move under its own power, without rupturing fuel tanks or cargo holds. Both ships were left floating, both crews were left alive, and both vessels were, in CENTCOM's words, no longer transiting toward Iran. By this point, American forces had disabled 4 vessels altogether in service of enforcing the blockade, and had redirected somewhere between 57 and 58 commercial ships away from the conflict zone entirely. A staggering logistical undertaking that speaks to just how much normal commercial shipping traffic through the Strait had been disrupted by this stage of the war. CENTCOM described the tankers in each case as non-compliant, language that framed the strikes not as acts of aggression in the traditional sense, but as enforcement actions against vessels that had been warned repeatedly and had chosen or been ordered to proceed anyway. Analysts who cover naval aviation closely were quick to point out what this pattern of strikes actually represented. This was not simply a case of American forces getting trigger-happy in a tense standoff. It reflected a deliberate and apparently well-rehearsed doctrine, one that defense writers began referring to as a controlled maritime denial strategy. The idea is straightforward in concept, even if it is extraordinarily difficult in execution. Disrupt an adversary's oil traffic and enforce a blockade without producing mass casualties, without triggering catastrophic oil spills in one of the most ecologically and economically sensitive waterways on the planet, and without handing the adversary a public relations disaster in the form of dead sailors or burning wreckage on international television. Every target chosen in these engagements, whether it was a rudder struck by cannon fire or a smokestack hit by a guided munition, was picked specifically because damaging it would immobilize the ship while leaving the crew and the surrounding environment essentially untouched. This approach did not emerge in a vacuum. It represents the maturation of tactics the United States Navy has been developing and refining for years, tactics designed for exactly this kind of scenario. A near-peer or regional adversary attempting to run an economic blockade using civilian-flagged or civilian-appearing vessels, in waters too congested and too politically fraught for the kind of blunt force destruction that characterized older generations of naval warfare. What made the Hormuz operation remarkable was not that this doctrine existed on paper. It was that the world got to watch it executed in real time, filmed, documented, and publicly acknowledged by the Pentagon itself, rather than buried in a classified after-action report. It's worth pausing here to consider just how much technical and human precision this kind of strike actually requires. A Super Hornet closing on a moving tanker at sea is not lining up a shot against a stationary target on a firing range. The ship is moving, often trying to maneuver evasively once it becomes clear an aircraft is inbound. The sea state affects both the aircraft's flight path and the visual and sensor picture the pilot is working with. Striking a rudder specifically, a relatively small and partially submerged component at the stern of a massive vessel, using a rotary cannon fired from a fast-moving jet, demands a level of weapons employment skill that very few air forces in the world possess. The same is true of using a precision-guided munition to hit a smokestack, rather than simply leveling the entire vessel, which would frankly be the easier and less demanding shot to take. Every one of these engagements was, in effect, a demonstration not just of American willingness to enforce the blockade, but of a level of technical proficiency that sent its own unmistakable message to Tehran and to the rest of the world watching. And Iran was watching, and Iran was responding. This was never a one-sided affair, and it would be a serious distortion of the record to present it that way. Iranian forces mounted their own attacks throughout this period. According to reporting on the American side, one particularly intense episode saw Iranian forces launch a cruise missile and 3 suicide drones at American destroyers operating in the region, despite what was described as extensive efforts by the U.S. Navy to repel the attack. Some of those weapons successfully struck their targets, causing fires to break out aboard the American ships. This was, by any measure, a real and reciprocal exchange of fire between 2 modern military powers in one of the most contested maritime spaces on Earth. Not a one-way turkey shoot against a defenseless adversary. Beyond the direct naval clashes, Iran extended its reach regionally as well. Reports emerged of Iranian attacks against the United Arab Emirates, with Iranian officials openly stating that the UAE would remain a target for as long as it continued supporting American and Israeli interests in the conflict. This regional dimension mattered enormously because it meant the war was never contained neatly within the boundaries of the Strait itself. Gulf states with no direct combatant role in the underlying dispute were nonetheless finding themselves drawn into the crossfire, their own shipping, infrastructure, and security put at risk by a conflict playing out largely between Washington and Tehran. The political rhetoric surrounding the Strait itself deserves particular attention because it reveals just how central this narrow stretch of water had become to both sides' strategic thinking. Mohammad Mokhber, an advisor to Iran's supreme leader, made a statement that captured the stakes about as starkly as language allows. He described Iran's control over the Strait of Hormuz as an asset on the scale of an atomic bomb, and he insisted that Tehran would not give up the leverage it had gained through the war. That is an extraordinary comparison for an Iranian official to make publicly, equating control of a shipping lane with possession of the most destructive weapon ever built by humanity. It tells you that, from Tehran's perspective, the Strait was never just a body of water. It was a geopolitical weapon in its own right, one capable of inflicting economic pain on the entire globe simply by being closed, disrupted, or contested. American officials, for their part, treated any Iranian move to formalize control over Strait traffic as an unacceptable red line. Secretary of State Marco Rubio addressed this directly, saying that reports overnight indicated Iran was attempting to establish some kind of formal agency to control shipping traffic through the Strait. And he stated flatly that such an arrangement would be unacceptable to the United States. At the same time, Rubio confirmed that the administration was still waiting on an official Iranian response to an American peace proposal, underscoring the strange duality of this conflict. Active military strikes against tankers happening in parallel with an open, if strained, diplomatic channel still nominally in play. War and negotiation were unfolding on simultaneous tracks, with neither fully displacing the other. This duality is worth dwelling on, because it explains a great deal about why the tanker strikes were designed the way they were. If the United States had wanted simply to destroy Iran's tanker fleet outright, sinking vessels and killing crews in the process, it possessed more than enough firepower to do so many times over. That is not what happened, and that is not what these engagements were designed to achieve. Every strike, from the cannon fire into the Hosna's rudder to the guided munitions into the smokestacks of the Sea Star, Thriu, and the Sevda, was calibrated to leave open the possibility of a negotiated settlement. Dead sailors and burning wreckage make for irreversible escalation. Disabled ships that can be towed, repaired, and eventually released make for a very different kind of pressure, one that inflicts real economic pain on Iran's oil exports while still leaving the door to diplomacy at least partially open. It's also worth noting what these operations reveal about the broader structure of American military planning in this conflict. This was never simply a story about fighter jets. The strikes on the tankers were the visible tip of a much larger and more complex operation. Carrier aviation provided the strike capability, but that capability depended on an entire ecosystem of supporting assets. Destroyers screened the carriers and, as the cruise missile and drone attack demonstrated, absorbed direct enemy fire themselves. Intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance aircraft tracked tanker movements across a vast expanse of ocean, feeding targeting data to strike planners. Electronic warfare aircraft worked to disrupt Iranian sensors, communications, and potentially the guidance systems of incoming missiles and drones. And Marine boarding teams stood ready to physically inspect and, when necessary, seize vessels suspected of violating the blockade. This layered architecture, as defense analysts described it, represented something genuinely new, an integrated system for maritime interdiction that fused together nearly every branch and capability of American naval and air power into a single, coordinated blockade enforcement mechanism. Some analysts have gone so far as to argue that these operations in the Strait of Hormuz may reshape how future naval blockades are conducted anywhere in the world. Choke points like Hormuz, the Bab el-Mandeb, or the Strait of Malacca have always occupied outsized strategic importance precisely because so much global trade is forced to funnel through such narrow and vulnerable passages. What the United States demonstrated in these engagements was a template for how a modern, technologically sophisticated Navy can enforce economic pressure at one of these choke points without triggering the kind of humanitarian or environmental catastrophe that might turn global opinion against the operation or that might collapse the diplomatic track entirely. Whether or not that template proves durable, whether it holds up against an adversary with more sophisticated air defenses or a willingness to escalate further, remains an open question. But as a proof of concept, the strikes on the Hasna, the Sea Star 3, and the Sevda were, in their own narrow and clinical way, remarkably successful. There is also a human dimension to this story that is easy to lose amid the discussion of doctrine and precision munitions. Every one of these tankers carried a crew, sailors who, whatever flag their ship flew and whatever cargo sat in its holds, were placed directly in harm's way by the collision of a geopolitical dispute far larger than themselves. The decision to target rudders and smokestacks rather than hulls and cargo tanks was, in the most literal sense, a decision that spared those crews' lives. It is worth remembering that not every vessel caught up in this conflict was so fortunate. The attack on the CGM San Antonio left 8 people injured. The broader tally of 46 incidents recorded by UKMTO, including 26 direct attacks and 2 hijackings, represents dozens, if not hundreds, of merchant sailors whose ordinary jobs, moving cargo and crude oil across the world's oceans, suddenly placed them inside a war zone they had no part in starting. The economic stakes underlying all of this cannot be overstated either. The Strait of Hormuz is not simply one shipping lane among many. It is the single most important oil choke point on the planet, the narrow gateway through which a substantial share of the world's seaborne crude oil exports must pass on their way from Gulf producers to markets in Asia, Europe, and beyond. Any disruption to traffic through the strait sends ripples through global energy markets almost instantly. Reporting from this period noted that shipping through the strait had slowed dramatically as a direct result of the blockade and the surrounding hostilities, driving up global fuel costs and rattling political and economic leaders far beyond the borders of the Middle East. When American officials spoke of reopening the strait, they were not simply talking about restoring freedom of navigation as an abstract principle. They were talking about stabilizing an artery of the global economy that, when constricted, raises prices at gas pumps and shipping docks on nearly every continent. This is precisely why the tanker strikes carried such disproportionate significance relative to their relatively modest physical scale. 4 ships disabled, dozens redirected, none sunk, no direct fatalities reported among the crews struck. On paper, that might read as a minor military footnote. In practice, each of those strikes represented a direct assertion of American naval power over the flow of Iranian oil exports, a tangible demonstration that the blockade was not merely a diplomatic threat or a policy statement, but an operational reality being enforced ship by ship, in real time, with real weapons. For Iran, a nation whose economy remains heavily dependent on oil exports even after years of sanctions, watching its own flagged vessels get systematically disabled by American cannon fire and precision munitions was a direct and unmistakable message about the cost of continuing to test that blockade. It is also worth considering the psychological and strategic messaging embedded in the specific choice of weapons used across these strikes. Using a 20mm cannon, a weapon system that dates back decades in various forms, to disable a modern oil tanker carries a certain symbolic weight. It is not a hypersonic missile. It is not a stealth bomber dropping a bunker-busting weapon. It is, in some ways, a strikingly old-school tool, one that requires a pilot to fly close, aim carefully, and fire with precision, rather than launch a fire-and-forget weapon from standoff range. That the United States chose, in at least one of these engagements, to rely on cannon fire rather than a guided munition suggests either a deliberate signal of confidence and control, a desire to minimize costs by not expending an expensive precision weapon on a relatively low-value target, or simply a pragmatic recognition that a cannon was the right tool for the specific job of shredding a rudder without any risk of an errant guided weapon causing unintended damage elsewhere on the vessel. In the case of the Sea Star, the Thrur, and the Sevda, precision-guided munitions were the chosen instrument, fired directly into the smokestacks, a testament to just how much operational flexibility American strike aircraft brought to bear across these engagements, mixing cannon and guided weapons interchangeably depending on the specific tactical picture each pilot faced. None of this occurred in isolation from the wider war. The blockade, the mine clearance operations, the failed talks in Islamabad, the brief and aborted Project Freedom escort mission, the missile and drone attacks against American destroyers, the strikes on Iranian tankers, and the parallel diplomatic track involving a still unanswered American peace proposal were all threads of the same conflict, unfolding simultaneously and influencing one another in real time. Understanding the tanker strikes in isolation, as a single dramatic news event, risks missing just how deeply embedded they were within a much larger and more protracted struggle for control over one of the most strategically vital waterways on the planet. Looking back at the sequence of events, what stands out most is the deliberate restraint embedded within what was, by any definition, an act of war. 4 tankers disabled, 0 reported crew fatalities from those specific strikes. No confirmed large-scale environmental disaster resulting from ruptured cargo tanks. And yet, the strategic message could not have been clearer. The United States Navy had both the capability and the willingness to identify, track, intercept, and disable any vessel attempting to breach the blockade, anywhere within the operational reach of its carrier strike groups. That combination of overwhelming capability paired with calculated restraint is, in many ways, the defining characteristic of this entire episode, and it is likely to be studied by military planners and naval historians for years to come as a case study in how modern naval power can be used to enforce economic pressure without triggering the kind of unrestrained destruction that has characterized so many earlier conflicts fought over control of vital sea lanes. As of the most recent reporting available, the underlying conflict between the United States and Iran remained unresolved, with both military operations and diplomatic overtures continuing in parallel. Whether the American peace proposal referenced by Secretary Rubio would ultimately produce a lasting resolution, whether Iran would attempt further efforts to assert formal control over Strait traffic, and whether additional tankers would find themselves in the crosshairs of American Super Hornets in the weeks and months ahead, all remained open questions. What was not in question, based on the events of early May 2026, was that the United States had demonstrated in vivid and very public fashion exactly how far it was prepared to go, and exactly how precisely it was capable of doing it in defense of its blockade against Iranian oil exports through the Strait of Hormuz. To fully grasp why these strikes carried the weight they did, it helps to place them alongside history's closest precedent, the so-called tanker war of the 1980s, when Iran and Iraq spent years attacking oil tankers in the same waters during their long and grinding conflict. That earlier era was defined by exactly the kind of indiscriminate violence that 2026 operations seem designed to avoid. Ships were struck with anti-ship missiles, set ablaze, and in many cases sunk outright, with sailors killed in the process and massive quantities of crude oil spilled into the Gulf. The United States eventually intervened in that earlier war by reflagging Kuwaiti tankers and escorting them through the Strait, a policy that led to direct clashes between American and Iranian forces, including the destruction of Iranian oil platforms and naval vessels. Set against that backdrop, the restraint on display in the 2026 strikes looks less like an accident of circumstance and more like a hard-won lesson absorbed over decades about the costs of letting tanker warfare spiral into unrestrained destruction. Military planners on the American side appear to have internalized that history, choosing rudders and smokestacks over hulls and cargo holds precisely because the alternative had already been tried and had already proven catastrophic 40 years earlier in these very same waters. The reaction across global energy markets was immediate, even if it was not always proportionate to the scale of the individual strikes themselves. Oil traders and shipping insurers had already been pricing substantial war risk premiums into contracts covering vessels transiting the Gulf since the earliest days of the conflict. And each new incident, whether a mine discovery, a missile exchange, or a tanker disabling, added fresh volatility to prices that were already elevated well above pre-war levels. Benchmark crude prices moved on the news of each strike. Insurers adjusted their war risk zones to reflect the expanding scope of the blockade, and shipping companies with no direct stake in the underlying dispute found themselves recalculating routes around the entire Arabian Peninsula, rather than risk sending vessels anywhere near the Strait. The fact that CENTCOM had redirected nearly 60 commercial ships away from the conflict zone by early May gives some sense of just how much ordinary global commerce had already been forced to reroute around a choke point that, under normal circumstances, sees a staggering volume of tanker traffic pass through it every single day. Regional reaction among America's Gulf partners was watched almost as closely as the strikes themselves. Nations along the southern shore of the Gulf, whose own economies depend heavily on unimpeded shipping through the Strait, found themselves in an uncomfortable position, generally supportive of efforts to check Iranian power projection, but acutely aware that their own tankers, ports, and coastlines sat only a short missile flight from Iranian territory. The reported Iranian attacks against the United Arab Emirates, explicitly justified by Iranian officials as retaliation for Emirati support of American and Israeli interests, underscored just how easily this conflict could widen beyond its original American-Iranian axis. Every Gulf state with a coastline on or near the Strait was, in effect, a potential secondary target, and every one of them had to weigh the economic benefits of an American-enforced blockade against the very real risk of becoming collateral damage in a war they had not chosen to fight. Back in Washington, reaction to the strikes split along familiar lines. Supporters of the administration's approach pointed to the absence of American or Allied casualties, the absence of any confirmed large-scale oil spill, and the demonstrable effectiveness of the blockade in denying Iran the ability to move its own oil through its own territorial waters, as evidence that the strategy was working exactly as designed. Critics, meanwhile, raised concerns about mission creep, about the risk that even a carefully calibrated blockade could escalate into a wider war if a single strike went wrong, if a rudder shot missed and struck a fuel tank instead, or if Iranian retaliation against American destroyers succeeded in producing American casualties rather than simply scorched paint and minor fires. Both sides of that debate were, in a sense, arguing about the same underlying reality, that the United States had chosen an extraordinarily narrow operational lane, one that demanded near-flawless execution on every single strike, with very little margin, for the kind of error that, in a less carefully controlled engagement, might already have triggered a far larger confrontation. The story of the MT Hasna, the MT Sea Star III, and the MT Sevda is ultimately a story about the changing character of naval warfare in the 21st century, where the most consequential strikes are not always the loudest or the most destructive, but the ones calibrated with surgical precision to achieve a specific strategic effect, while minimizing collateral damage, casualties, and irreversible escalation. It is a story about a century-old naval squadron putting a decades-old cannon design to a strikingly modern use. It is a story about a narrow strip of water that, once again, proved capable of holding the entire global economy hostage to the outcome of a regional conflict. And it is, above all, a story about how quickly the balance of power at sea can shift when one side decides that the way to win a blockade is not to sink the ships trying to break it, but simply to make absolutely certain those ships never reach their destination at all.